Hello everyone, welcome to Biocool class. Today's topic is carbohydrate. And carbohydrate is a type of biomolecule. And today we will learn what are carbohydrates, what are polysaccharides, how to draw the structure of glucose, and how to draw the structure of fructose, what are disaccharides, what are polysaccharides, what are anomeric carbons. Okay, all these concepts we will study today. What is how the two kind of monosaccharides they join together and they form a disaccharide uh, by a dehydration reaction. So all these concepts we'll study. So first thing first is carbohydrates are basically they are biomolecules made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And they are the most abundant category of molecules in the living things. The most abundant category of molecules in the living things. And if you look at in both plants and animals, they have an important role as energy, and in plants, they have a structural role. So, two things, energy and structural function. When I say energy, by breaking down carbohydrates, we can get ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate, which is basically the energy currency um, of our cell. So carbohydrates they form ATP by cellular respiration. By cellular respiration, which involves glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. So this involves glycolysis. This involves Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. These two later reactions take place in mitochondria, and glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. That takes place in the cytoplasm. So basically, carbohydrates like glucose, which is known as the glucose is known as the respiratory substrate. It is called the respiratory substrate because we can why it's called respiratory substrates, because glucose can be readily broken down and energy can be released. Okay, and again, just to know, okay, glucose is the simplest form of carbohydrate. That means when we take complex carbohydrate, like starch, which is a complex carbohydrate, which is a polysaccharide, this can be broken down to glucose by the process of digestion, in which polysaccharide is broken down by digestive enzyme like amylase into glucose. Glucose is the simplest form. It is absorbed in the small intestine. And it goes to the blood. Then from the blood or the blood vessels, glucose goes to the cells. Inside the cells, cellular respiration takes place and ATP is formed. So as you can see that glucose is providing energy in plants and in animals. In plants, glucose has a functional, also a structural role. So structural role, what do you mean by structural role? So if you go to the plants, there a plant has cell. Plant cell has cell wall. So this cell wall has cellulose. we learn about what is cellulose. Cellulose gives strength to the plant. Okay, so it has also a structural role. Uh, Coming back to the notes. Okay. So I said they are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and we also said that they also have. Okay, so they are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they are also kind of the most abundant molecule in the living system, and also they function as energy and also as a structural role, right? So now we'll learn about the structure of glucose and the structure of fructose. So all these basic carbohydrates we'll learn. So when we look at glucose structure, so glucose is basically six carbon compound. Six carbon compound. So six carbon means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The first carbon here we have an aldehyde group. Okay, so we call this is the aldehyde group. Aldehyde group. Aldehyde group is a type of functional group, just like we have hydroxyl uh, alcohol group or hydroxyl group is a kind of functional group. So we have various kinds of functional groups. Phosphate group is a functional group. Okay. Then carboxylic acid, COH. This is also a type of functional group. So we call this carboxylic acid. This is also a type of functional group. Carboxylic acid. Okay, and this is an alcohol or hydroxyl. So these are all functional groups, just like that. Aldehyde, which is CHO, is also a functional group. Okay. What else we have in glucose? So glucose has six carbons. This is the first carbon, second carbon, third carbon, fourth carbon, fifth, and the sixth carbon. So as we know that the carbon has four bonds to satisfy. Okay. So the other carbons in the glucose has a CHOH group. The third carbon has a OH flipped on the left side. So if we say that this is the left side, this is the right side. So on the left side, we have a OH group present in the third carbon. And then the fourth carbon again has a OH on the right side. The fifth carbon also has OH, and the sixth carbon has a CH2OH. CH2OH. All right, so this is actually glucose structure. If you look at a fructose structure, we'll draw the fructose with fructose is another kind of monosaccharide. And looking at the fructose structure, the fructose has CH2OH. This is the first carbon, second carbon, third carbon, fourth carbon, fifth carbon, sixth carbon. The second carbon, it also has an OH. Third carbon has OH here. We have OH like that. Okay. And we have a CH2OH. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that is the picture of a fructose. So let's just verify. So you can see the one small change, we'll make it here. So here we have see as a carbonyl group. So that is one small change I have to make. So this is the carbonyl group. This is the aldehyde group. This is called the keto group. Okay, so this is the keto group. So we have CH2OH, CO, then OH on the left side and OH, all these three OH on the right side of fructose. If we draw this is the open chain. So these two are called the open chain structure. We call this open chain structure. If we draw in a ring structure, so glucose and fructose can be also drawn in a ring structure. So how does the ring structure look like? So now we'll draw the ring structure of glucose. The ring structure of glucose we have, so we draw an oxygen like that, and you can see each of these. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So here, each of these dots represent a carbon. All right. So this is a carbon. This is the first carbon, second carbon, third carbon, fourth carbon, fifth carbon. And then we have a CH2OH. This is the sixth carbon. Okay. So we have OH, H. So COH. C on one bond we have OH, another bond we have H, right? This third one, the OH is on the top of the plane. Here, the OH is the bottom of the plane. So this is the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and the sixth carbon. Okay. This first carbon is bonded with a oxygen and a hydroxyl. Very, very important. So this first carbon is bonded with a oxygen and with a hydroxyl. So this first carbon is called the anomeric carbon. It is called the anomeric carbon. Okay. So if we look at, so this is a glucose ring structure. So now if we look at an open structure of glucose, so let's side by side also draw an open structure, which will help us to understand this concept better. So an open structure has the aldehyde group. This is the first. Then we have, so total six carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. And as you can see, this is OH, H. The third carbon, the OH is on this side. We have OH, H, and OH. This is the CH2OH. So this is the CH2OH. We'll draw it with the green. The CH2OH. This is the CH2OH. So this is the open structure, and this is the closed ring structure. Okay. We call this as the pyranose structure. Okay. So this 6 carbon ring is also called the pyranose structure, and this is the open chain structure. Okay. Now, if you look at fructose, then fructose has this. This is how the fructose ring structure looks like. Okay. This is called the furanose structure. This is called the pyranose. This is called the furanose structure. So furanose structure, what's interesting is there is OH, CH2OH. This is carbon number 1. This is carbon number 2. This is carbon 3, carbon 4, carbon 5. Okay. And here you have carbon 6. There is an oxygen here. Okay, right? And then this structure we can draw as OH, OH at the bottom. Okay, and this OH is basically this bonded with this one. So this is the anomeric carbon, because this carbon is bonded with the O and it is bonded with the hydroxyl. So this is called the anomeric carbon. So we'll come to know what is the significance of anomeric carbon. Just for the time being, just know anomeric carbons are the carbon which is bonded to the oxygen and the OH, right? So in case of glucose, the first carbon is called the anomeric carbon. And in case of fructose, the second carbon is called the anomeric carbon, which is connected to the O and the OH. Okay. So now we will learn about what is a reducing sugar and what's a non-reducing sugar. So now we have learned what is an anomeric carbon. We have learned the structure of fructose. We have learned the structure of glucose. So now just looking at the structure wise. So here we can see this is the glucose open structure. And as I said, now we can review this glucose open structure. So here, this is the aldehyde group. And then we have the carbones, hydroxyl groups. You see the third carbon is flipped on this side, the hydroxyl group. The rest hydroxyl groups are on the right side. If you look at the fructose has a CH2OH, and then there is this keto group. Okay, CO group is called the keto group. CHO is the aldehyde. This is the keto group. And again, we have all the hydroxyls on the right side and one hydroxyl flipped on the left side. If you look at the ring structure of glucose and the fructose, so now let's look at the ring structure and let's try to verify. So this is basically the fructose structure. And I said that this is how the furanose structure looks like. You see, this is a furanose structure. And if you look at the glucose, this is called the pyranose structure, right? The furanose and the pyranose structure. Okay, we have different kinds of carbohydrates. We have glucose, we have galactose. So when you look at between glucose and galactose, what you can see, so glucose, this is carbon 1, this is carbon 2. You see the third carbon is the hydroxyl is flipped on the left side, and this is the right side. But if you look at the galactose, the third carbon and the fourth carbon both have the hydroxyl flipped towards the left side. That is the only difference between galactose and glucose. So you see they are basically isomers having the same molecular formula. But when you look at the structural arrangement, the fourth hydroxyl is flipped on the left side, whereas in glucose, the fourth, fifth, and the sixth hydroxyl are on the right side. Okay, so that's the difference between galactose and glucose. Fructose is also an isomer of glucose. It's only the structural formula, the structural arrangement is different, but the formula is same. All they have C6H12O6. That means they have 6 carbon, 12 hydrogen, and 6 molecules of oxygen. That is the formula of all these. These are all isomers. Okay. Again, when you look at mannose, you see mannose second carbon is flipped on the left side, right? Third carbon is flipped on the second hydroxyl is flipped on the left side. Other things are just like glucose. Only difference is this part. You see, in case of mannose, the second hydroxyl is flipped on the left side. This is glucose. You see in glucose, all these hydroxyls are on the right side. Only the third hydroxyl is on the left side. When you look at the galactose, we have the fourth hydroxyl is flipped. So they're all isomers with a little bit of structural differences. Okay, and also this is the structure of fructose. So now we will learn the concept of what is a reducing sugar, what is a non-reducing sugar. So now I have said that anything which has a free anomeric carbon, So let's look at this concept. So this is the anomeric carbon, you see. This is the carbon joined to the oxygen and the hydroxyl, right? So if this anomeric carbon is free, if it is not bonded with any other kind of molecule, then it's called a reducing sugar. That means this sugar can reduce other compounds, other molecules. So here, this is basically how reducing sugar looks like. Let's compare these three. So now you can see this is the picture of sucrose. A sucrose is a disaccharide made up of glucose and fructose. So we can just magnify this picture. Here, we can magnify this. And we can see here, this is sucrose, which is basically made up of fructose and glucose. Okay, made up of fructose and a glucose. And what we see here is this is the glucose, and this is the alpha carbon, or this is the anomeric carbon. You see, this is the anomeric carbon. So if I have to draw here, so now this is the glucose, and this is the first anomeric carbon. You see, the anomeric carbon is bonded with the anomeric carbon of the fructose. You see, the anomeric carbon is bonded with the anomeric carbon of the fructose. So glucose anomeric carbon and the fructose anomeric carbon, they're bonded. Bonded means, when I say bonded, it means it's not free. It's not free. So this cannot react with any other compound. It cannot react with any other molecule. So this is called a non-reducing sugar. So in a non-reducing sugar, this anomeric carbon, again, what's an anomeric carbon? Anomeric carbons are carbon which is actually bonding with the oxygen and it's bonding with the hydroxyl. So this anomeric carbon is engaged with a bond with the fructose. Okay, so when we look at this picture, we can see that here the fructose and the glucose, they are bonded, okay, and their anomeric carbons are involved in the bond. So these anomeric carbons are not available for bonding. So that's why it's called a non-reducing sugar. If we now go to a reducing sugar, just like a lactose, we can see in case of lactose, which is made up of glucose and galactose. So lactose is a disaccharide which is made of glucose and galactose. And we can see how in case of, so this is the glucose, this is the galactose. Okay. So now when we look at this thing, so this is basically the galactose. This is the galactose and this is the glucose. Okay. And in the glucose, we can see the anomeric carbon is free. You see, this carbon is free. It is not bonded with anyone. If you compare this with the, above sucrose, right? If you compare with the sucrose, which is also a disaccharide, here you can see the anomeric carbon here is bonded. Okay, but in case of lactose, which is made up of galactose and glucose, here the anomeric carbon is free. This one is free. This is carbon number 1. This is C1. It is free. Here look C1 and the anomeric carbon and the fructose, they're all engaged here. So this becomes a reducing sugar. That means it can reduce some other molecules. For example, if you react this with copper, okay, then copper can be reduced from its cupric to cuprous. So from its cupric form, it will be reduced to cuprous form. Okay, so the reducing sugar, if the anomeric carbon is free, just like in case of lactose, which is a reducing sugar, lactose can react with any kind of copper salt, copper salt, just like in Benedict's reagent. So Benedict's reagent is basically a type of reagent which is copper based, and Benedict's reagent has this cupric solution, and this cupric is where the copper is in the +2 state, right? It's in a +2 state. So this Benedict's reagent can be reduced to a cuprous form where copper is in a +1 state, right? So this is called reduction of copper from a cupric to a cuprous state if the copper reacts with a reducing sugar. A reducing sugar is, example of reducing sugar is lactose is a reducing sugar. It is basically a disaccharide which is reducing, right? If you look at sucrose, which is a non-reducing sugar, because its anomeric carbons are engaged in bond formation, sucrose will never reduce the cupric to cuprous form, right? When you add Benedict's reagent to a solution of sucrose, it will not reduce. When you add Benedict's reagent to a solution of lactose, then the reduction will take place because lactose is reducing sugar. Coming to maltose, you see maltose is also a reducing sugar. Why maltose is reducing sugar? Because maltose is alpha carbon or the anomeric carbon. Look, maltose is made up of two molecules of glucose, right? So glucose, how will you know what is the glucose, what is the galactose? Look here in glucose, this is carbon number 1, carbon number 2, carbon number 3. So carbon number 3 has a OH above the plane. But if you look at the galactose, you see that carbon number 4 also has a OH above the plane. If this is the plane, right? Above the plane, you see the OH is there in the galactose. In case of glucose, we will not see the only one H, the third carbon OH is above the plane, right? So now when we look at maltose, which is the disaccharide, this maltose here, this anomeric carbon is free. This anomeric carbon is free. And since it's free, it can react with any other molecule and it can reduce again, just like we have the Benedict's reagent. Okay, so just to give an idea of what is the Benedict's reagent. Just to give an idea of what is the Benedict's reagent and how Benedict's reagent reacts. So here, this is the Benedict's reagent. You see, Benedict's reagent is blue in color, but if you add a reducing sugar to the Benedict's reagent, so this is basically this one is basically a cupric solution. Here the copper is in the Cu2 plus state. Okay, this is a cupric solution. So when we add this Benedict's reagent to a reducing sugar, which has a free anomeric carbon, we see that this cupric is reduced to cuprous form, and this cuprous form gives a brick red color. So from a blue, the Benedict's reagent changes into a brick red color, right? So when this thing happens, we know that this sugar is a reducing sugar. Reducing sugar is converting from a blue to a brick red color. Okay. So now we learn what is anomeric carbon. We learn what is reducing sugar. We learned what is how to test for the presence of reducing sugar by using a Benedict's reagent. Okay. Again, these figures, they show the same thing, that this is a reducing sugar. You see D-glucose is reducing because the anomeric carbon is free. It is free to bond. Okay, again, why it is anomeric carbon? Because this carbon it is bonded to a oxygen here and a hydroxyl, right? That's the anomeric carbon. If you look at the sucrose, there you see the carbon number 1 of the glucose. So again, sucrose is a disaccharide made up of glucose and fructose, and the anomeric carbon, the carbon number 2 in fructose. Remember, carbon number 2 is the anomeric carbon in case of fructose, right? Because this carbon number 2 is bonded with oxygen and a hydroxyl, right? That's why it is anomeric carbon in fructose. This is bonded in case of sucrose. That's why sucrose is a non-reducing sugar. That means if you react sucrose with a Benedict's reagent, it will not reduce the cupric form to a cuprous form of copper. Okay, so that means the Benedict's reagent, which is blue in color, it will remain blue when you add sucrose to that. Okay, all right. With that concept, we will go to, so now that we have learned about reducing, non-reducing, now we will go to the concept of bond formation. Okay, how monosaccharides, they join to form disaccharides. So if we look at the formation of here, you see this is basically a glucose and a fructose. And we know glucose and fructose, they join together to form sucrose, right? So this is basically glucose and fructose. Glucose has this OH, fructose has also this OH, right? So when they join together, you see this OH and H. So I can draw like this. This whole thing is escaping as water. And this is called the dehydration reaction is taking place. And this dehydration reaction is forming a bond called the glycosidic bond, right? So this is now sucrose, which is a disaccharide. Okay. Again, sucrose is a non-reducing sugar because it does not look here. This is carbon number 1, which is basically the anomeric carbon. And in fructose, this is carbon number 2, the anomeric carbon. It is in bond formation. It is forming glycosidic bond. So this is a non-reducing sugar. This is a non-reducing sugar. Okay. So this is how disaccharides are formed. Disaccharides can again link with another monosaccharide and it can form a trisaccharide, and like that it can finally form a polysaccharide. Just like we see polysaccharides are starch, glycogen, they are the polysaccharides. So now we know how, so now we look at some of the monosaccharides and the polysaccharides. So if we look at this picture, we will see these are the monosaccharides, like glucose is a monosaccharide, fructose monosaccharide, galactose monosaccharide. Again, when we are looking at glucose and galactose, one thing to notice is glucose has these hydroxyl groups at the bottom. Third hydroxyl group is on above the plane. If this is the plane, right? So it is above the plane. If you look at the galactose, the fourth hydroxyl group is above the plane, right? So that is the only difference between glucose and galactose. So this is a disaccharide. You see, this is basically a sucrose. Also lactose. Lactose is made up of glucose and galactose. How can we know this is galactose? Look, the fourth hydroxyl group is above the plane, right? This is glucose, how they're in a linkage, a glycosidic linkage to form lactose. So galactose, glucose together, they're forming lactose. Again, lactose is a reducing sugar. Why? Because this is the sugar, this is the carbon number 1. The anomeric carbon is free to bond with any other actually molecules. Unlike the sucrose, where the anomeric carbon is bonded, it is not free. And look, this is basically cellulose, starch, and glycogen, which are the polysaccharides. So now let's look more clearly into the polysaccharides, how the polysaccharides look like. So this is how the 3 different kind of polysaccharide we'll talk about. We have starch. You see how it is bonded by glycosidic bonds. This is the starch. You see, it's a polysaccharide made up of many units of glucose. All right. And you see, sometimes there are these branches. So I'll try to zoom this thing, and we can see this is starch. Look, there is some kind of branching. It's moderately branched. Starch is moderately branched. It means glucose, glucose, glucose. Look how the glucose units are linked like that by glycosidic bond. And sometimes they have these kind of branching. Okay, if you observe very carefully, so this is a 1,4 linkage. You see, first carbon and fourth carbon, 1,4 linkage. So we can call this, because this is the carbon number 1, this is carbon number 4. So we can call it 1,4 linkage. And look, this is carbon number 6, this is carbon number 1. So this is called the 1,6 linkage. So starch is a polysaccharide. Why polysaccharide? Made up of many glucose units, many monosaccharide glucose units. And starch has two kinds of linkage, 1,4 linkage and 1,6 linkage. With the help of 1,6 linkage, they form the side branch. Right? They form the side branch. Starch is moderately branched. Why I say moderately branched? Because if you look at glycogen, glycogen is heavily branched. So let's look at the picture of glycogen. This is glycogen. Glycogen is, so now starch is the storage form in case of plants. So plants, they carry out photosynthesis and they make glucose, right? This glucose is stored in the form of starch in the leaves, right? Whenever they need it, they will again break down starch, which is the polysaccharide, into individual glucose units. If you look at the glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, so glycogen is the storage form of glucose in animals. And in animals, where it is stored in the liver, right? Look at glycogen, how branched it is. Again, we have a 1,4 linkage is there, right? And then there is a 1,6 linkage is there. Again, there is a 1,6 linkage. So it is more branched compared to starch, right? It is highly branched, glycogen. Finally, we have the third category, which is the cellulose, which is present in the cell wall of the plants. Cellulose is not branched. You see, there is no branch in cellulose. All right. And this is unbranched, and we call this as the fibrous structure because it's like a fiber. You see, there is no branching, just straight chain. That's why cellulose fibers, they come parallel like that. Okay, so each is a cellulose fiber, so they come as parallel as a bunch, and that's what makes the plant cell wall so strong, because in the plant cell wall you see there are parallel cellulose fibers as branches, as bunches. We call them microfibrils. Okay, they come as bunches. That's why these cellulose, so fibers, we call fibers. That means when we have vegetables, right, doctors say that we're having a lot of fibers, right? In the morning when we have the Kellogg cereal, right, the cereal is basically fibers. Because why fiber? Because cellulose is present in the plant cell wall. Cellulose is like a fiber, right? There is no branching. That's why we call it fibers. Fibers, they, if you consume lots of vegetables, that will increase the formation of roughage. What is roughage? Roughage is basically, it's something which is coating the large intestine. It helps in the bowel movement, right? In the bowel movement. That means if you consume lots of vegetables, then our bowel movements, that means there will be no constipation, right? There will be no constipations because this roughage, that is basically nothing but the fibers, the cellulose fibers, which we find in the cell wall of the plant cells of the vegetables. They will form a coating in the large intestine, which will help in bowel movement, smooth movement of excretory materials, in the large intestine. Okay, so these are the three different types of uh, polysaccharides. Very popular polysaccharide starch, which is moderately branched. So now we know what is branching. And we have glycogen, which is a storage form in the animals, in the liver. It is highly branched. And we have cellulose, which is not branched at all. It is all straight chain like fibers. Here we have a comparison of cellulose, starch, and glycogen. We can see how cellulose is present in plants. And we see starch is actually made up of two kinds of two kinds of structures. Starch has amylose, which is basically like cellulose, which is a straight chain, there is no branch. And starch also has amylopectin, which is 1,4 and 1,6 linkage. Okay. When you look at cellulose, there is only 1,4 linkage. So now we know what's a 1,4 linkage, right? So we need to look at the 6-ring carbon, right? And we see how the 1,4 linkage. So it has only 1,4 linkage, right? First carbon of one ring and fourth carbon of another ring. There is no branches. Again, starch is made up of two kinds of structures. Amylose is just like cellulose, which has no branching, and there is amylopectin, which has both 1,4 linkage and a 1,6 linkage. When you look at glycogen, it is highly branched, and there is 1,4 and 1,6 linkage. Okay, so this is how glycogen looks like. You see how highly branched. This is how cellulose looks like. This is how amylose of starch looks like. This is how amylopectin of starch looks like. Okay, so remember this thing, that starch is made up of two kind of forms. Starch has amylose, which is just like cellulose, with only 1,4 linkage, and there is amylopectin, which is highly branched. Now, one thing, what is an alpha and what is a beta glucose? We need to understand this concept. So now this is very simple concept. If the hydroxyl group, so let's see. So here, what is an alpha and beta? So let's say this is a ring structure of a glucose. Okay, and this is the first carbon, which is the anomeric carbon, right? Because it is bonded to hydroxyl, oxygen and hydroxyl. If the hydroxyl group is below the plane, what is the plane? So this is the plane, you see, right? If it is below the plane, this is basically the OH. So this is also OH. This is OH, and this is CH2OH. Make sense? Okay. So now, if this is below the plane, we call it an alpha glucose. Okay. With the same concept, if we have the first OH above the plane, so again, I'm drawing the plane here. This is the plane. If it is above the plane, so this is H, this is OH, okay, this is OH, this is OH, CHOH, and this is CH2OH. So this is called a beta glucose or a beta glucose. Okay. So beta glucose, the hydroxyl is above the plane. In case of alpha glucose, this is below the plane. In other words, we can also say, if we don't have to say plane, in a beta glucose, you see the CH2OH and the OH, they're on the same side in case of a beta. In case of an alpha, you see this CH2OH and the OH, they're on the opposite side, right? This is the plane. This is on one side of the plane. This is on the other side. So this is an alpha configuration. This is a beta configuration. Okay, so we need to remember that also. So that's why in sometimes you will see these kind of alpha glucose, beta glucose. Now when we come back to this chart, this is now clear. Okay, so now when we come back to this chart, here, now we come back to this chart. So now we know what is a beta glucose, what's an alpha glucose. Okay, if the OH is above the plane, it's a beta glucose. If it's below the plane, then it is the alpha glucose. All right. So finally, so we have learned what's a glucose structure, what's a fructose structure. We have learned what is the different types of carbohydrates, glucose, what is galactose. Okay, we have learned, look, in case of fructose, this is basically an alpha fructose. You see the OH is below the plane. All right, so let's try to understand this concept again. So how this is the alpha, because the CHOH and this is on the opposite sides. Okay, and this is the beta because the CHOH and the OH are on the same side. All right, so this is what we learned. And next, we learned about the different kinds of what is a disaccharide, what's a monosaccharide, what are the polysaccharides. We learned what's an anomeric carbon in this lecture. We also learned what's an alpha. Look, this is a beta. You see, this is the alpha. Sorry, you see the OH are on the opposite sides, and this is a beta. This is an alpha. Sorry, this is the alpha. This is a beta. Beta has the same side, and alpha has the opposite side. You see, the CHOH and the OH in the alpha are on the opposite sides of the plane. Here, they're on the same side. So we learned that. We learned what's a reducing end, what's a non-reducing end. Reducing end, you see how the anomeric carbon is free here, right? And this is a non-reducing end because the anomeric carbon is bonded. This C1 carbon is bonded. Okay, so we learned what's reducing end, what's a non-reducing end. And we also learned that sucrose is a non-reducing sugar, lactose is a reducing sugar, maltose is a reducing sugar. We learned what's a Benedict's reagent. Okay, what is the Benedict's test? In this test, we find out what is a reducing sugar, what's a non-reducing sugar. A reducing sugar in a Benedict's reagent will give rise to this brick orange, brick red color, because we are reducing the cupric to the cuprous form. Okay. This is how the glycogen looks like. You see how much branched it is. So I think we'll end the lecture here. Watch my biofuel classes for more lectures and more knowledge, detailed knowledge into the into biochemistry, into biology, and we'll come back. I'll come back with more topics. Okay, all the best and bye bye.